So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. So this is my capstone defense, trust in the Canadian municipal sector, the role of communicators and the public relations function. Our agenda for this morning is I'll take you through the research problem, highlight some of the literature that was studied in this research, look at the methodology for the study, go through the results and some discussion of those results. I've made some recommendations and then talk through the conclusion and some limitations of the study. So jumping right in, I'll begin with some context as to what sparked this idea for me. So all of us on this call are likely familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer. Every year they report on the status of trust across the private, public, not-for-profit, and media sectors. And so trust in government has seen some big changes in the last few years. But the report tends to focus on the federal level of government. And I was curious about the municipal level, which anecdotally, in my experience, seems to receive less profile in Canada than other levels of government. So I was curious about that impact. So that's how we landed here. So that takes us into the research problem. And so that's how and to what extent communicators in the Canadian municipal sector understand the principles of and contribute to stakeholder trust. So I sought to answer that with three research questions. How and to what extent do municipal communications professionals recognize building trust with stakeholders as a priority for both the organization and for their roles? How and to what extent communications professionals use theory in their plans, strategies, and general approach in their work? And then looking at what tactics they're using and how those are supported or not by theory and best practice. So we'll move into the literature review. Trust obviously is a huge topic, and there was a lot of literature study that I won't be able to go into detail on here. But essentially, one generally accepted definition in the literature is the concept that one party, the trustor, assesses the probability that another party, the trustee, will behave in a dependable way that meets their expectations. And that's a definition from Gambetta, who's done a lot of research on the trust sector. And so there are great benefits to trust for any organization. And Kramer explains that there are three in particular that he focused on. So the first is that trust can facilitate the operations of business and reduce cost by creating less conflict during decision-making. Trust engenders support and cooperation from stakeholders. And third is what he calls voluntary deference. And that's when people trust an organization, they're more likely to comply with its mandates and regulations and less likely to challenge decisions. So those are all three ways that will benefit organizations. In terms of how you build trust, Hahn and Grunig identify three dimensions that they believe contribute to trust building: integrity, the belief that the organization is fair; dependability, that the organization will do what it says it will do; and competence, that the organization can do what it says it will do. Consistently acting in an ethical manner is also key to earning trust. Edelman et al. Assess that assert that trust must be earned and re-earned with every customer transaction and contact, and reaffirmed with every stakeholder interaction. So they're looking at that from a private lens, but essentially the concept is the same, that repeated, consistent ethical action is a keystone to building trust. And Stein says that communications practitioners can help build trust, obtain legitimacy, and achieve organizational goals through their role in ensuring stakeholder norms and values are represented in the organizational strategy. So that's how the communicators contribute to this. Looking at trust in government specifically, as I mentioned, there's numerous factors that can impact trust in government. Scholars point to everything from wider societal changes, actions of the government, misinformation, disinformation, and government performance, to name a few. For example, scholars have found links between service level satisfaction and confidence in government. So trust is definitely multifaceted. Looking at reputation, and reputation is how the organization is perceived by its stakeholders. There's a number of different definitions, but that is kind of one thread that runs commonly through them, is that it's how the organization is perceived by its audience or stakeholders. Doerly cites trust as the most important long-term benefit of reputation and makes the distinction that trust is not the same as reputation, it is an outcome of reputation. One model that's used heavily in the research, in reputation research, is Fombrum's 5-star model. And it has some elements that align with Hahn and Grunig's 3 dimensions of trust. And so the 5-star model looks at visibility, authenticity, transparency, consistency, and distinctiveness in terms of reputation management. And so transparency came up a lot in this research. Looking at public sector reputation specifically, the research suggests that there are some challenges that the public sector faces that the private sector might not. Luoma Aho suggests that the organizational ethos for public sector organizations fundamentally differs from that of corporations, as well as their functions, scope, stakeholders, and aims. They may also be impacted more greatly by sector reputation. This is again research by Luoma Aho, and she asserts that a challenge here is that stakeholders with limited knowledge of the organization's attributes can still form a perception of the sector. So in this instance, that would be somebody who's not necessarily familiar with the specific operations of their municipality, but they have a general perception of government, and that can inform how they feel about their specific municipality. There is also literature that points to 5 problems that the public sector faces when managing reputation that the private sector does not. So the first is politics, and that means that there's a larger political oversight and will of the organization. Consistency, and so municipalities and government are complex organizations, and often they have competing priorities that may contradict each other. So that makes it difficult to be consistent. Charisma is part of the nature of the public sector's role, is dealing with difficult issues that may never get fully resolved, which can make it difficult to feel positively about those and the organization. Uniqueness, the scholars argue that building reputation involves highlighting elements that make an organization distinct from its rivals, which is not necessarily appropriate for government. And similarly, in terms of excellence, they assess that reputation is competitive. And so when one organization's standing increases, that would suggest that another would decrease, which again may not be appropriate for the sector. And then finally, looking at excellence in public relations, this study explored research about the 2 asymmetrical model outlined by Grunig and Hunt. We looked at communications functions placed within the organizational structure. Siramesh et al. Argue that by relegating public relations under another department, an organization will not harness the function's strategic potential. Grunig reinforces this in the excellence study by noting that sublimating public relations to another department causes it to lose its unique role in strategic management. And he goes on to further say that unless it's empowered to be heard, public relations will have little effect on organizational decisions. Research also suggests that business leaders believe that communications function contributes to achieving organizational goals by bringing those external voices and opinions into the strategic management process. And so that value is added through the function's ability to scan its environment. And that's research done by Grunig as well. And by public relations, including ethical decision-making and strategic management, trust is also created and built, and the organization and function become more excellent than they had been. So when the organization acts with ethical responsibility on a consistent basis, it increases its knowability, and the expectations of its stakeholders are met, thereby building trust between organizations and its stakeholders. And that's research done by Bowen and Gallicano. And then a code of ethics can help an organization consistently make ethical decisions. It can be used to provide direction when decision makers are faced with a dilemma, and by doing so has the potential to enhance an organization's reputation, according to Hartman et al. So that is a high-level look at some of the research that was looked at in this study. Moving into methodology, the audience for this survey was communications professionals who either currently or who had worked in the last 5 years in a communications capacity in the municipal sector, so working for a municipality in Canada. So there were 70 responses collected. The survey was open from March until June. And non-probability sampling techniques were used. Recruitment was done through social media and email recruitment. And a call for the survey actually was shared via One Interesting newsletter through some of that outreach that had been done. Participant information was anonymous as well, with no way to identify participants being included in the questions. Okay, let's move into the results. So the demographics, again, 70 responses were studied. Of those 70 responses, 64% were at the manager level or higher.
In terms of the demographics of the municipalities that were looked at, 59% came from a municipality with a population of over 100,000. 17% came from a mid-sized municipality with a population of 30,000 to 99,999. And 24% came from a small municipality of under 30,000. There were no responses from any municipalities or organizations smaller than 1,000. One insight that came from the demographics piece, before even really getting into the research questions, was a correlation between the size of the municipality and the size of the communications team. So you can see from this slide that the likelihood of having a communications team of 1 to 3 people increased with a smaller municipality size. So those larger, over 100,000 plus, that was very much not the rule, but those small municipalities seem to be mostly a small team. So this may speak to some of the capacity challenges that some of those smaller municipalities may experience. So moving into research question 1, and again, that was the how do municipal communicators recognize building trust with stakeholders as a priority for the organization. So overall, the results show that communicators did recognize the importance of trust to their organization and acknowledge their role in building it. When asked about the importance of trust to a municipality, they collectively highlighted key themes from the research. For example, in an open-ended question asking to explain the benefits of trust, 75% highlighted the operational impacts of trust. So those were such as license to operate, its impact on relationships, and the better business outcomes that come from having trust. And this quote was one of the responses received from that open-ended question. And so one of the respondents indicated that the community, while the community may not agree with something, at least they understand how decisions are made and they come to acceptance faster. And it's easier to do the business of the municipality when there is trust. So they identified that as one of the benefits. Another piece that came from that open-ended question that I thought was interesting to highlight was a challenge for municipalities in terms of building trust. And so this respondent indicated that they spend a lot of time doing internal education. So they're educating other staff on the importance of those concepts of transparency, things like keeping the website content accurate and ensuring that they're informing residents of decisions. So they're saying that they're working with their internal staff to advise them to think about their audience and think about the recipients of these projects and to put on those different hats to see those different perspectives. So I thought that that was an interesting insight as well. It suggests that maybe the communicators are being called upon to be the educators of their organization, and that perhaps their impact on trust goes further than just, how they're creating those direct communications pieces. So some of the information that we looked at was asking communicators to identify what they thought were some of the contributors to distrust. And so the highest ranked factor was the misinformation and disinformation was identified as a top reason for the decline in trust in government. And so this is supported in the research. So the research does support that it's an increasingly important factor. And this may suggest that these communicators are witnessing and recognizing what the research is showing, that misinformation and disinformation are on the rise and the impact that it's having on trust in government. Interestingly, the least commonly selected answer here was service levels, unsatisfactory service levels. But coming back to the research, there was some information that suggested that there is a correlation between service levels and impact on the relationship between the stakeholder and the organization. So still ranked really high. Of course, you can see it's over 50%, but it was interesting that that was, the least selected. So in terms of how they're recognizing their role in building trust, 100% responded when asked part of their role they contributed to building trust, 100% answered yes. So when asked to briefly explain how they contributed to trust building, the most common response, again, touched on those principles: transparency, openness, and honesty. It was interesting that, of course, while everyone noted it was in their role to build trust, 96% of respondents also indicated that they felt that it was the responsibility of everybody inside the organization. So it shows that they're not alone in this endeavor. Looking into research question 2, and again, this is the how and to what extent communications theory is playing a role in some of the work that they're doing. There were a number of insights that came out of this question. One of the interesting ones, or some of the interesting ones, related to the function's position and perceived influence in the dominant coalition. So you'll see here that 43% of respondents indicated that the top communicator is a member of the senior leadership team in their municipality. Of those, I thought was interesting, of those respondents, the percentage that responded that the top communicator always contributes to decision-making was only 10%. So while they're sitting at that in that leadership team, perhaps the impact of their presence there is open for interpretation. So on the graph on the right, you'll see that, again, this is the data that shows those responses. So you'll see that the always is a small percentage at 10%, often is nearly 60%. So it is still a good result in terms of how much they think that they're contributing, but the sometimes, rarely, and not sure are still about 30% of the respondents. So there's a couple different things that might be happening here. Either there's still a need to demonstrate the strategic value that communicators bring when they're a part of that leadership team, or perhaps it's an issue of internal education, even amongst the team itself. There may not be an awareness of how much the communicator is contributing to that decision making. On the other side of that, so this is when organizations where communications is not part of the dominant coalition, you'll see that the contribution to decision making is significantly different. So it was only about 30%, about a third, 33% are either often or always, and the majority is in the sometimes, rarely, or never responses. So what that might suggest is that there's definitely more room for communications to contribute at the senior level. It also shows that communicators are more likely to contribute to organizational decision-making as a member of that senior leadership team. A similar result when looking at ethics. So 40% of survey overall, 40% of survey respondents indicated that the communications function always or often advised senior leadership on ethical issues. When looking at the group whose top communicator was a member of the senior leadership team, that rose to 50%. So that suggests that for communications function to fulfill its full potential as an advocate for ethical decision-making, it is better positioned to do this as a member of the dominant coalition. It also shows that there's further room for improvement for communications to advocate for ethical decision-making at that leadership table. And again, and that's important because, as Bowen and Gallicano illustrated, that when ethical decision-making is included in the strategic management of an organization, trust is created and built. And by consistently acting ethically, an organization further builds trust by meeting the expectations of its stakeholders. So that is an important angle to look at that. It was also interesting that the majority of respondents answered that their organization did have a code of ethics, but from looking at the instances of how often they're advising on ethical issues, perhaps that's not always top of mind at that table. It was interesting as well looking at municipality size. So 29% reported that the top communicator reported to the city manager, but was not a member of the senior leadership team. So overall, from all results from all respondents, when breaking that down by municipality size, that was more likely to be true in a small municipality again. So for those medium and large municipalities, that structure was reported by about 25% of respondents. And for the smallest municipalities, that was reported by 41% of respondents. So looking at some of the other theoretical pieces that came out of this, so communicators are using a variety of methods to collect feedback and monitor stakeholder expectations. So when asked this was looked at from a couple of different angles. So in an open-ended question about how they monitor stakeholder expectations and collect feedback, the most common response indicated that they would use their personal contacts and tap those networks and discuss with them to get a feel of what's happening in their community. And the research does support that is an effective way of environmental scanning. When asked to identify from a list of methods, the digital methods were highly rated highest. So those are social media, and use of surveys was highly rated as well. As well, public engagement and consulting priority groups were
certainly the majority. There was no result that was less than 50%, but the digital method seemed to be the most selected in terms of selecting from a list. Looking at how they do engagement with priority groups, respondents were asked how they decide to engage a group when they're beginning a new project. And the vast majority answered, it depends, a very Terry Flynnism. So when they gave that it depends answer, they were given an option to elaborate and tell us what it depends on. So some of those examples were the scope of the project, how contentious it is, if there was actually genuine feedback to incorporate, or genuine opportunity to incorporate feedback. And so that shows that there is maybe an opportunity to put in some guidelines on stakeholder engagement and look at how organizations are doing that as well. And then moving into research question 3, which looked at the tactics and how those are supported by best practice theory. Two-way symmetrical approaches were preferred by the majority of respondents. So respondents were given different types of scenarios and different types of communications work and asked to select their preferred methods of tactics and engagement for each of those scenarios. And throughout those questions, the two-way symmetrical type of approach that allowed for feedback and engagement were the highest selected. So that does suggest that they are understanding that method. And also, communicators are considering trust. So when asked how often they're thinking about trust as they're making, their programs and their projects and their tactics, every participant reported that they are either always, often, or sometimes thinking about how what they're doing is impacting trust. So it is top of mind for them. So moving into some recommendations. The first would be to adopt a framework to determine how and when to engage stakeholders. So from the research, organizations appeared to have a bit of a case-by-case approach on deciding when to engage. So a framework might help make some of those decisions easier, and even just give rationale for some of those engagements if there's ever any difficulty about that. The second recommendation would be that organizations should have a code of ethics, with communications playing an active role in creating an ethical culture. So there were a number that, the majority did report that they did have a code, but communications can help spread the ideas and create an ethical culture and ensure that even if they do have a code, it's not just a document on a shelf. So communications can ensure that it's something that's understood and internalized and use its position as a strategic advisor to create that culture and understand the impacts of why that's important. The third recommendation is ensure access to the Dominant Coalition for the top communicator. So while the excellence study does suggest that the function should be a member of the Dominant Coalition, I recognize that that's not necessarily realistic for all organizations. I don't think that they're all going to change their organizational structure because I say so. But there should be at least access to the Dominant Coalition for the top communicator to be included in discussions about organizational priorities. So informal access as well. The fourth recommendation is including communications in the onboarding of all municipal staff. And so I know that sounds like a large ask, especially when we're looking at these smaller organizations with limited resources, but I think that the benefits could be significant. So as the respondent earlier indicated, that they do spend a lot of time doing education, but I think building education in at the front end of each employee's time with the organization could help set a baseline of understanding for the impact that every person's role has in building trust. And so what that model looks like, if that can't be a communicator in terms of the resources, even just developing some of the literature materials to help share, again, those ideas could be beneficial for the organization. And then the last recommendation is to conduct a reputation audit on an annual basis. So as Dorley mentioned, trust is an outcome of reputation. So organizations who measure their reputation at regular intervals might be able to see patterns and trends emerge, which should then give them insight into the state of trust that they have in the organization. One thing to note for this recommendation is that when doing these measurements and these audits, they should consider those factors that make public sector reputation more challenging than the private sector reputation, and so incorporate that into whichever model that they're using. Moving into conclusion. So some big key takeaways is that it does appear that communicators working in this sector do understand the impact of trust and their role in it. It does appear that their work is being informed by theory. However, there may be room for improvement. Well, there's always room for improvement. And it does appear, again, that their preferred tactics are aligning with theory and best practices. The study did uncover some areas of vulnerability as well. So, of course, we've talked about those smaller municipalities are found to have less resources, which we know can be really significant. Communicators are facing the challenges of educating the rest of the organization on how their actions impact trust. And so even with following best practices, if service levels are suffering or if there's something else happening within the organization at a political level, the impact of communications, having the theory and doing all that work can be diminished because they're not alone in this. This is not, their sole responsibility. So that is a difficulty that communicators are going to face in this sector. Looking at some limitations, again, the sample was made of convenience and snowball sampling tactics or techniques. So that means the study cannot be generalized to the larger population. The language for this survey was only available in English, so that likely did not capture the experience of Quebec municipalities, and there may be some differences there as well. And then measurement bias, I thought might be potential here as well. Because of the nature of the study, participants may have given what they felt were more socially desirable answers, or what they thought was what we wanted to hear, because it is, everyone wants to think that they're doing their best to engender trust, I would assume. So that might impact some of the answers. Thank you. So I want to say thank you to Jackie. I would not be here without you. You really helped push this boulder up the hill. And to Terry and Alex, if Alex is here, you've both been a tremendous support to me through the last nearly 3 years. And of course, my fellow 14 cohort.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you. So I'm going to start it off with Jackie.
Thank you so much. And has Alex arrived, Terry?
He is not.
Okay, because maybe we can both get a couple of extra questions on his behalf.
Yeah.
So the first one, did you catch your breath? I saw you took a drink of water there.
I've got a tea.
Congratulations for getting through it. So the first question I have is sort of a housekeeping question. You talked about stakeholders, that it was how communicators interact with their stakeholders. For the purpose of this study, do you want to just explain for the audience who is included in stakeholders? How were you defining that? Because I know that it was more elaborated on in your study.
It was, yes, thank you. That's a great point. So stakeholders were used particularly because of the external facing nature of this. So, not everybody may be familiar with the term publics versus stakeholders. So to keep it simple, stakeholders is kind of a universally recognized term. So that is constituents of the community. So residents, businesses, anybody who's really impacting the organization and who the organization is impacting. It was how we looked at stakeholders.
Thanks. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about is, there were a few of your findings that I thought were really interesting. One was the role of internal communications. One is that public versus corporate organization. And then the other one is the fact that disinformation and misinformation, were much higher than any of the other challenging issues, including service levels. So I'm going to start off with the role of internal communications. And given that, not only political representatives who certainly have a big part to play in the reputation, but also all of those staff, whether it's in the planning department, the works department, people on the roads, the parks department. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what you found in your research about the role of internal communications. And also I noticed that really two of your recommendations related to that. One was about the code of conduct and one was about onboarding package. And maybe you can just talk about what you think communicators can do in their internal role to support the reputation of the municipality.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there's a huge role for internal communications. Again, as evidenced by some of that research, is that
communicators are not doing this in a silo. So advocating some of these policy or some of these theories and sharing that within the organization, I think is going to be a significant role for communicators. So the importance of it is really having everybody understand and how they connect to this, and that it is not, just the role of the comms team to clean up a crisis and then, make everybody trust us again. It really is back to that like operational institutionalization of these theories and values that all lead towards the same objectives.
Thanks. My second question is on that public versus corporate organizations. And you outlaid quite a bit when you were talking about your lit review and in your findings of your study as well. I'm wondering, and I know you had a recommendation on that as well. Can you elaborate on that piece and maybe what communicators who are working in that public sector? And I know that there are some, I think even maybe on this call, some people who work, in fact, a lot of communicators work in the public sector and not-for-profit organizations versus corporate. And it really is a different dynamic. Can you really maybe talk a little bit more about what you found both in the literature as well as anything in your study and speak to the recommendation that you included there?
Sure. So in terms of the recommendation, it's, understanding your reputation is really key to understanding how your trust is essentially being perceived. So that's why the audit recommendation is there. But I think that so much of the literature that's out there on reputation is really focused towards corporations, and there is much less on these particular, public sector challenges. There's certainly some. A lot of the existing research seems to be by European scholars, but they're definitely highlighting some of those same challenges that we would see here as well. And so in terms of how to navigate those, I think understanding that even exists is barrier one. I'm not sure that would necessarily be on everybody's radar, that these challenges, they may feel some of those tensions in their day-to-day work and understand that their job is made more difficult because of, for example, political wills and influences, but they may not recognize that there is actually maybe a theory that can help them navigate this. So as much education as we can do in the sector about those types of challenges, I think is important. And then how they consider them, I think I would advise them to kind of look at the experiences from their own organization and see where some of those challenges are, and how that relates into those theories. So, the charisma problem of, garbage pickup is never perfect. For example, nobody's ever, super thrilled. It just kind of happens. And when it goes off the rails, that's when it becomes a challenge. So it's hard to find those kind of wins in some of those more mundane, everyday operational pieces. And so recognizing that and identifying where you can, how you can influence maybe some of that perception.
Yeah. You mentioned that transparency came out really strong in your study. Do you think that that's something that's of greater importance in the public sector?
I think definitely that's, I think it's important everywhere, but I can definitely see how it is more important in the public sector. I think the public sector is really held to, I don't know if it's higher, but it's definitely a different standard than organizations. I think there's definitely more expectation of things like transparency and access to information for public sector than private. Private sector has, their own rules and bylaws that they can kind of essentially decide, versus public sector is they're here to serve everybody and they don't get to decide kind of what they share or who they can share information with. It's open for everybody's access. So I think there's definitely a higher expectation of transparency.
Yeah, and probably more to manage on that as well. Thank you.
Definitely.
I'm going to pause it there and turn it over to Terry.
Well, boy, I didn't think I'd be able to get a question in. Jackie's like running the time. She's running the clock here. I'm an insider. Wow, that's good. Anyways, great questions, good answers. A couple of things that I think are missing. One is, who are these people? Where are they from? And I know I don't think you did gather that data, but if from a survey standpoint, it would be nice to know if I was reviewing this for publication, where are they from across Canada? Canada's a big place. is this happening more so in one place than the other? So can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, and admittedly, that would be great information that I wish I had. In terms of, yes, so I have some anecdotal evidence just in terms of some of the interactions and some of the outreach that I did. So for example, the newsletter that this was shared in was a British Columbia Municipal Government Association. So I know that there's a response from the West. I emailed, I essentially cold emailed every municipality. I went through the largest municipalities down and essentially emailed as many as I could that had public email addresses or had a open forum message to send to. So I did email every province across Canada. I sent messages to the larger cities in Quebec. I don't know how many responded, but and even some of the Northern Territories as well. So, but yes, if I was to design this study again, absolutely, I would ask that question.
So just, did you think that you just didn't want to gather that kind of information because of MREB, or what? Why was that?
I think I was just trying to keep it as anonymous as possible, and anything that was in any way able to identify someone, I was trying to limit. Again, just I know it's a bit of a sensitive subject in terms of how people feel about trust. So I think I was just really wanted to make sure that I wasn't infringing on any of those, maybe identifiable elements.
Yeah, I think, for those that are, listening and, going through this down the road, that there are still some demographic information. I mean, you've got some in terms of the size of municipality, but province would be the basic minimum, right? So that you could say, is there a trend? Is this happening more so in Ontario? Because we know, one of the biggest issues with respect to municipal government is that they are, as you quote in your paper, creatures of the provincial governments, and they are uniquely differently constructed across this country. So, what happens at a municipality of 100,000 in Ontario is certainly different than a municipality in Newfoundland or Alberta or BC. So I think part of that information gathering is that we should try to get that kind of data just to help make sense of it, because right now it says, okay, well, this is Canada, but we know that there are 13 different perspectives in terms of local government as well.
Yeah.
What if you go to table 5, where it says, and it was, what page was it on? Just was on it. This was about influence, to what degree they thought that they had influence. This is on page 38.
I said, I'm joining you there. Yes.
Okay. So fully 68% of people believe that they have virtually no or very limited influence. Why would communicators go into this profession?
I mean, I think that nobody goes into this profession thinking that they're not going to have influence. There was a bit of research that I looked at very lightly that in terms of different types of organizations, authoritarian organizations versus ones that have a bit more of an open culture. So I think so much of it is dependent on leadership. We've had some really great examples of leadership through these capstones this term alone. So I think it really, there's so many different factors that can play into influence. One individual's experience may vary, significantly under a different leader in a different type of culture. There's lots of factors that might influence that.
Yeah, and I think because you have the dual-headed kind of reporting, that you have, that you're in some cases playing communications advisor to politicians, and then you're also giving counsel and advice to the management administration of it, that it becomes a very difficult place as well. And you can't hide in municipal governments. You can hide in provincial governments and in federal governments, but here you're virtually on the front lines.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough kind of gig, because you have this kind of duality. And just to answer what Jackie said about public sector communicators. Well, but although we don't have any empirical evidence, if we just kind of go across the country and think of how many people work in local federal and provincial government. They are the biggest chunk of any communication groups in Canada, period. So, I mean, it is a very important and worthy group or sector of the population. But, you know, the lack of influence, I think, would be something that would deter the best communicators from going there. And yet they probably need that strong CCO type of leadership to be able to help navigate them. I mean, I'm sure your City of London could have used a seasoned communicator during some very difficult times that they've gone through over the last 5 or 10 years, right? Which municipality do you think is doing it the best?
I mean, I think that's difficult to answer because I only have my lived experience with the one that I interact with. So my experience, you know, in my day-to-day life is so closely tied to the City of London versus somebody who, you know, lives in Ilderton or somebody who lives in Toronto or Vancouver. You know, the extent to which they, and I think there's even an extent to which, you know, people are even aware of some of the issues that they're having. And when I say people, I mean the general public, citizens may not even be aware that, you know, a challenge that they may feel is under the municipal purview or provincial. They may not understand which issues lie under which umbrella. So I think it's tough to say who's doing it the best. I think there's probably great lessons from every organization and challenges as well.
Okay, I will pause at this point, send it back to Jackie, and then we'll do another round.
So one of the questions I was going to ask is, I thought another really interesting part of your study, and that really did come out. And I think although you didn't have it provincially broken down, what you did have it broken down with was by size of municipality. And also one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the size of teams. And even maybe with the exception of very large municipalities, consistently small teams, communication teams, given that large role that Terry just spoke to. So I think, you know, the next question that I have is really about, given the limitations that they have. So we've talked about the importance of internal communications and, you know, educating not only the staff, but also the political, and then some of the challenge of dealing with the personalities and the expectations of politicians to be out there saying what they want to say. And then you've layered that on with their number one concern, which was disinformation and misinformation. So they're managing small resources. They're managing trying to do that, you know, be that culture guide for internal communications, working presumably with the HR function, which is probably small as well. And then they're also trying to deal with managing social media and expectations for transparency. So given all of that, what would you say, you know, for those teams, what do you think are really important professional training and maybe resources or tools that they can help to deal with this onslaught of, you know, so many things coming at them from different places, while also having a really probably under-resourced team?
I think understanding elements of, like, I think understanding the theory behind all of what they're experiencing would help them. So any of those, you know, MCM programs or master's programs, I think that just helps lend a level of authority in when they're doing that internal education. So, you know, they've got the credentials to back up that they know what they're talking about. So they're not just annoying you because they need your information on the website. Like there's a purpose to all of those requests that they're making of their colleagues and staff within the organization. And I think it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily considered a tool, but I think that as many advocates as they can help build in the organization to help them share those messages is also only going to do good things for them. As you said, like there's so much coming at them, you know, everything, like you have to update from the website because of roads closed. Like there's so much of that mundane day-to-day stuff that I think is, you know, as many of those people that they can have with that culture mindset about how all of this work is impacting the whole organization. They don't have to do it alone. They've got ambassadors on their team, you know, in all areas of the organization to help them spread those ideas.
So building a network.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Whether it's formal or informal, you know, if there's
whatever that looks like. And I'm sure it would change depending on everybody's, depending on the organization and the resources.
Yeah. And I kind of put a few questions together there just because we don't have a lot of time. I think just that whole disinformation, misinformation, and managing that is probably a whole, next step study in and of itself from this. I thought there were some really interesting, this is a comment, not a question. I thought there were some really interesting findings, and this is a great example of where you get something quantitative that tells you things that then you could turn this into a qualitative where you start to really then dig down into the why and the details of how this is happening, and so I thought from that perspective really provided us a really interesting look at the landscape out there. And Terry, as soon as Amanda and I got her results, the very first thing I said is, oh shoot, we didn't get the province breakdown. So we knew that we didn't do that. But I do think that in looking at the design, part of it was the focus of really trying to think through the sizes, and that was the comparable, and it was just, missing that piece. But point very well taken, not only from the student, but also the supervisor.
Thank you. So you also hit on the other thing that I think would have added an interesting flavor to this as well. And that's why, the triangulation is important, that depth interview standpoint, right? In terms of what is missing, because, and again, we do this from either an inductive or deductive perspective. Then you say, okay, I have this sense of what it is. We're going to go and survey. I want a bigger number. But then that opens questions that you would really want to sort of backfill and say, okay, well, that's interesting. What else could we learn from this perspective as well? And perhaps one of our new members of MCM 17, who's coming into the program, who is the director of communication for one of Canada's largest municipalities.
Ooh.
I won't say their name, but maybe they would take up this mantle and sort of move on to the next step. Point as well. So what are you going to do with this? Where are you going to share it? How are you going to mobilize the knowledge that you've gained through this?
So I have a lot of very interested people who emailed me. So as part of my cold calling or cold emailing outreach approach, I had a really great response from people who were working in municipalities, and they were also really keen to have the results, because as part of my letter, I said, you can request the results, and a really high response did. So starting there, we'll definitely share with those folks, and as well with that municipal association, because they were interested in having those results. So we'll start there with having some of those conversations. Jackie and I have discussed potentially publication in the McMaster journal, so we'll talk about that potential. But I think from there, starting those conversations with the folks who are interested and kind of seeing what comes in from there.
Well, I would suggest the Municipal Communicators Conference that happens in November, that MCM is one of the key sponsors of. That might be a good place to offer it. And we can talk more about how our sponsorship might open up a slot to be able to do that for you as well.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any questions from our audience? I want to see Adam, he left because he didn't want to be put in the situation where I had to ask him to ask you a question.
Well, I know he did have a meeting, so.
Great. And Rebecca said all covered. That's good. Well, I'm going to put you in a room with your colleagues. Just give me a second to do that. And then Jackie and I will have a conversation. There they are. See you in a couple of minutes.